On January 10th, 2013, almost 8 whole years ago, Cyberpunk 2077 was revealed to the world by CD Projekt Red, or CDPR. It was a straightforward CG trailer showcasing a hyper-slow-mo scene of what appears to be a woman with cybernetic mantis claws attacked by law enforcement after presumably performing a total massacre on civilians. This video didn't show anything particularly mind-blowing, but what really got everyone's attention was the potential sitting behind it. Could a game truly look like this? Not necessarily in visual fidelity because it's a CG trailer, but in style and setting. Could a AAA game truly grasp onto that slick, neon-lit dystopian world and deliver an equally investing gameplay experience? The trailer sent everyone's imagination and expectations for a spin, but unfortunately it was still a hell of a long way off, evidenced by the ending, where a simple message clearly states, in no uncertain terms, coming when it's ready. This was a time where CDPR was still somewhat unknown, and only familiar to some by their work on the first 2 Witcher games. Witcher 3, which would be the game that finally shoved them into the spotlight and turned them into a household name, was still 2 years off at this point. So many were unsure of how a license like Cyberpunk would be tackled by the growing Polish studio. However, when Geralt's third outing finally released to very respectable reception that seemed to only get better with time, fans and admirers of CDPR only became more and more confident in the developer's ability to deliver. After the initial reveal, we heard very little about Cyberpunk 2077 all the way up until E3 2018, where a new CG trailer debuted, showing off the world with significantly more detail, including narration from who would end up being the main character, V. From that point on, it was full steam ahead for the hype and marketing train. CDPR pulled 0 punches in cultivating a level of anticipation that hadn't been seen since probably the reveal of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Everyone was amped up about how the Polish developer was gonna knock it out of the park, just as they had with Witcher 3. They had so much experience creating fascinating worlds and stories they couldn't possibly screw up, right? Well, the lead up to the game's release sadly didn't inspire much confidence. It was first slated for an April 16th, 2020 release, then pushed back to September 17th, then again to November 19th, and then one last time to December 10th. CDPR also came under fire for putting employees through months and months of strenuous crunch time, an unfortunately common practice in AAA game development. So after 8 years of waiting, 3 delays, and tens of thousands of overtime hours, did Cyberpunk 2077 live up to the words presented at the end of that revealed trailer? Was it ready to come out? Let's talk about it. In Cyberpunk 2077, you play as a character simply called V. After selecting your life path, a decision between Nomad, Street Kid, and Corpo, and creating your character, you're set into the world of Night City, where crime is rampant, mega corporations rule, and the quickest way to earn a buck is to do freelance dirty work in the seedy underworld. Regardless of your chosen path, your situation eventually leads you and your best friend Jackie to one specific job, a heist on one of the world's most powerful families, the Arasakas, specifically the heir to the Arasaka Corporation throne, Yorinobu. You're tasked to steal an extremely valuable asset straight out of his penthouse home. But as all heists that kick off stories always go, it ends badly, and the asset you were supposed to take, a relic, ends up slotted into V's head for safekeeping. Little does V know the relic contains the personality and consciousness of legendary rocker boy and anti-corp terrorist Johnny Silverhand, which slowly takes over V's brain, dooming him or her to the very uncommon death of being overwritten, with Johnny himself unable to stop it. The drug-addled rockstar manifests as an unwilling companion along the journey to find a way to stop the relic from taking over V's mind. As you can see, the central story of Cyberpunk isn't so much of a rags-to-riches tale as it is a tale of simple survival against a piece of technology that no one else understands. The game utilizes Johnny Silverhand as a sort of reluctant, judgmental, and narcissistic guardian angel who can steer you either toward or away from the more rewarding path in accordance to his own dogmatically anti-corp views. Sometimes his intuition ends up correct, and sometimes it gets in the way. It's up to you if you wish to listen to his advice, which comes in between or even tangled within his complaints and insults. In some cases, V is also given the choice to willingly surrender his or her mind and body to let Johnny take over momentarily to accomplish certain tasks. Thus, his involvement in the story isn't as some sort of rarely seen NPC as you might expect from the fact that he's portrayed by Keanu Reeves, but as a straight-up secondary protagonist who you even control from time to time. And furthermore, Keanu does an amazing job at being this violent, stubborn, shit-flinging asshole of a character. In some specific interactions with other major players in the narrative, he's downright actively antagonistic to whoever V is talking to, or perhaps even to V themselves, depending on their choices. He even has offhanded comments to make during side jobs that you might never even do if you simply push through the main story without doing anything else. He's a world-weary, stone-faced, harshly critical, selfish war veteran who isn't interested in much outside of blowing up megacorps. But as the story progresses, you're given chances to sit down and talk to him, get him to open up, and eventually become friends, despite how much of a dick he is half the time. This is part of what Cyberpunk 2077 was actually able to pull off. Great characters. The cast is full of people who shine in their own way, even minor characters who ultimately aren't relevant for very long or only offer support to V once in a blue moon. They come from varying backgrounds and have personalities that are distinct and products of their professions. From fixers who are cynical, distrusting, and ruthless, to paranoid politicians, to V's own friends who are likable, agreeable, and supportive. So many characters are sincerely interesting that it's a damn shame that the game flat out underutilizes a lot of them in its surprisingly short main questline. And they're all extremely well acted, without suffering from the same obvious voice actor overlap that some other open world RPGs have. You know which games I'm talking about. If there's another area the game knows how to lean into, it's aesthetics. Cyberpunk 2077 doesn't go into the style of its setting half-heartedly. Night City is a true symbol of a corporate-ruled futuristic dystopia covered in grime and blood, and the game deftly merges cyberpunk stylistics from the 80s with more modern-day designs. The vehicles look awesome, the weapons look slick, the cyberware you see on yourself and NPCs look really cool, and the HUD and menus have a strongly computerized motif. CDPR's art department sincerely knocked it out of the park here. The music in this game is also stellar. Both the licensed tracks commissioned specifically for the game and the original score are full of total bangers across many genres, including synthwave, EDM, hardcore punk, and hip-hop. There's a ton of cuts here worth seeking out and jamming to even when you're not playing the game. While the central plot and characters prove to be some of the game's stronger points, the lack of the aforementioned rags to riches aspect may prove to be a sort of missed opportunity, and is a symptom of a much greater problem the game has, a severe lack of actual role-playing. This probably comes as a surprise considering how much CDPR was hyping up the role-playing parts of the game, and the fact that this is an adaptation of a tabletop RPG. One of the most anticipated portions of the story was life paths. A lot of people expected the 3 different life paths to have significant influence over your experience and force you to play through the game multiple times in order to truly do everything that there is to do. CDPR even said as much themselves. However, life paths ended up being very shallow 20-minute intros that quickly railroad you toward the central story. The substantial, consequential life path portion of the game that the studio marketed to us just doesn't exist. The unique dialogue choices that appear based on your life path do pop up about once an hour on average, but rarely do they change the outcome of the actual scene or reveal important information that makes your mission easier. Even character creation is lackluster, because there's no sliders to truly adjust the proportions of V, nor can you change height, weight, musculature, or age. Many thought the character creator would be so deep that most people would spend an hour just crafting their V, but it turns out it's not even as deep as the character creator in Dark Souls. As an extension to this, there's also attributes. Combat-wise, they serve their purpose of increasing stats and making you a more effective fighter with perks just fine. However, they also have the secondary function of allowing for unique dialogue options too. Sadly, these are also frequently wasted, and very rarely offer the opportunity to make certain conversations go smoother, or access new information, or increase rewards. On the plus side, they do allow certain missions to go by faster, specifically by letting you enter areas or bypass obstacles if certain attributes are high enough. If there's one thing that the dialogue aspect of the game's role-playing does right, it's that silence is sometimes the right answer. In certain story-driven games that have a time limit for responses, the player is usually scolded for being quiet, not just by other characters, but by the game itself. Here, staying silent is sincerely the best response sometimes, and I appreciate that. Then there's romantic options. If there's one thing that was heavily marketed by CDPR to draw attention, it's sex. The studio really liked to imply that you could fuck anything that moved, and even gave the option to customize V's genitals. Lo and behold, this ended up being a PR stunt that the game took zero advantage of, because no one comments on your crotch and you sure as shit don't see it in the actual sex scenes. Plus, the amount of characters you can actually have sex with is paltry, with actual relationships being much worse. There's only one romanceable character per sex per orientation for V. Meaning there's only one romantic choice for a straight male V, one for a gay male V, one for a straight female V, and one for a gay female V. That's it. There's one bisexual fling, and there's bisexual prostitutes you can visit, but they're not really the same as the fleshed out supporting characters who get several missions to themselves. So if you want to look for something more serious, your choice is the one character they give you, or nothing at all. With a selection of potential romantic partners this pathetic, CDPR should have just made all 4 of them bisexual. But RPG elements are only half the story. What about the actual combat, or navigating the open world? There's a more solid foundation to be found here, but it's also a mixed bag in itself. Combat, generally speaking, is quite serviceable, perhaps even great if you find a weapon you really enjoy the feeling of. Personally, I became quite fond of powerful weapons like revolvers and double-barrel shotguns. For me, they made combat really fun, especially with the dynamic gore that allows you to blow off enemies' entire limbs and sections of their heads, or their whole head in fact. Encounters can also be bolstered by whatever mods you have installed on your person, including a double jump and the famous mantis blades, which can slice and dice hapless mooks with ease. Stealth elements are also present. You crouch to sneak and then do a lethal or non-lethal sneak attack on unsuspecting foes, and perhaps utilize things like throwing knives or maybe takedowns from above if you unlock them. The more intriguing parts of stealth come from quick hacks, which are functions that give you the ability to manipulate the environment to do things like distract enemies or turn off cameras or safely take down your foes from afar, without firing a single bullet. Overall, combat is pretty solid. I wouldn't say there's anything particular to really write home about, but it serves its purpose well enough, and is generally much more enjoyable than the combat in the Witcher series. When you're not fighting, you're likely taking a drive out in the open world, or exploring for some loot, or perhaps buying some gear or clothes from one of the game's many vendors. The simple act of wandering around and letting the wind guide you around Night City is something that's fine on a base level, but is hampered down by subpar mechanics. First things first, driving. Vehicles in this game have an awesome aesthetic and are cool to look at, both their exterior and interior, but how they control is a different story. Driving is a mixed bag in this game. When you're behind the wheel of something meant to go fast, like a muscle or sports car, it can feel incredibly drifty, and you need to wrestle with the thing just to ensure it stays in a straight line. It makes heavier vehicles more desirable despite being slower. Some cars take forever to make a turn, probably because the game is trying to mimic slight wheel-turning delay that exists in real life, but it just makes things feel annoyingly unresponsive. Same thing with trying to brake. It's easier to get used to it if you play with a controller, but if you're on PC and insist on driving with a keyboard, you're probably in for a hell of a time. To add on to this, there's the minimap, which is painfully zoomed in with no option to zoom it out, even when driving at very high speeds. I can't even begin to count how many turns I've missed because of it. I find myself staring at the upper right corner of my screen more often than actually focusing on the road so I can see and prepare for a turn in time. Matter of fact, the minimap is way too zoomed in general, even when I'm on foot. It's barely able to show me what's around the corner or even across the street. The minimap is also sometimes totally useless when trying to stealth through a hostile area, because enemy vision cones are significantly longer than the map suggests, and you can be spotted by someone who's not even within your map's range. The only thing it's truly reliable for is seeing nearby loot to pick up, represented by X's whose color depends on the item's rarity. Funny how CDPR implemented a useful little feature like that, but somehow didn't think to add something as basic as one extra zoom out level. Then there's AI, not just for enemies you fight, but for everyone. AI for any and all NPCs in this game is just terrible, sometimes non-existent. In combat, yes, enemies can be pretty bad, showcasing their stupidity by getting stuck behind walls and shooting at nothing, or conversely, blindly rushing at you in the middle of a heated firefight to shoot you at point-blank range for some reason without paying any mind to the concept of cover. Increasing the difficulty doesn't make them smarter either, it just turns them into damage sponges. But it doesn't stop there. Civilians out in the open world have pretty poor AI too. When they hear gunshots nearby, they either crouch where they are and start cowering, or run a few feet away and then crouch and start cowering. They also never interact with each other outside of scripted events between specific individuals who are designed to have lines. Nor do they enter buildings, call the police, or even enter or exit vehicles on their own. Anything. Again, this is in spite of CDPR claiming that everyone would have detailed routines to help make Night City feel alive and lived in. And don't even get me started on the AI of drivers, or lack thereof. AI drivers don't chase you or exit their vehicles to fight you if you ram into their ride because they're not programmed to do that. AI drivers don't get aggravated if your car is parked in the middle of the road and try to ram it off, because they're not programmed to do that. Sometimes when shit goes down nearby and bullets start to fly, they'll just stay cowering in their vehicles and not even attempt to run away on foot or peel out in a hurry. Finally, as the cherry on top, there's law enforcement, who suffer from a very egregious case of GTA police syndrome. They don't truly track you and no one has to actually call them. They literally just spawn right behind you and you need only sprint away and through some alleys or something to effectively escape them. Because, as mentioned, AI has very primitive and weak chasing mechanics. So yeah, Night City is populated alright, but by robots who stick to a very shallow and easily predictable routine. Thankfully, not everything about the core experience is so half-hearted. Just as investing as the main story itself is side jobs, given to V through other support characters, which include several independent arcs dedicated to your friendships, romantic interests, and also catching up with Johnny Silverhand's old buddies. These collections of subplots introduce characters and minor narratives that you would otherwise never meet or experience if you just stayed on rails solely through the central story. These side jobs feel substantial, as if their completion may contribute to some sort of huge change in the final act of the main questline as a reward. Most of them don't, sadly, perhaps another infraction against the game's lackluster role-playing mechanics, but still, they're worth doing. Some of these arcs are divided into several individual missions available all at once that you can do in any order, such as underground fistfights or searches for rogue AI taxicabs. There's also illegal street races, but thanks to lackluster AI, your competitors are constantly rubber banding, and the game makes no effort to hide the fact. Simpler 5-minute or even 1-minute missions do exist and are usually given to you as gigs, encountered out in the open world. These aren't as detailed and engrossing, but they typically offer some worthwhile rewards, like rare gear or just straight cash. Without much substance to them though, they start to blur together after you've done a couple dozen, and there's many more to do after that. So generally speaking, Night City isn't all that barren. However, the combination of main story missions and side jobs of actual consequence can all be completed in around 25 hours or so of playtime. And the rest is, frankly, busy work in comparison. So Cyberpunk's scale really isn't a massive 100-hour game like some people may have expected it to be before it came out. It's more comparable to a Ubisoft game in this regard, with most world activities summed up as go to this icon, do small task, and repeat. And the topic of expectations leads me to ponder what is probably one of the biggest letdowns of this game: the sheer amount of missed opportunities. The world of Cyberpunk is one that is absolutely teeming with interesting ideas, and despite all the hype CDPR tried to drum up with exaggerations and flat-out lies, most of those ideas have gone unrealized. As I mentioned earlier, probably the biggest culprit is the lack of true role-playing. Dialogue choices rarely conclude a scene in a substantially different way, and ultimately seem to not matter much on a case-by-case basis between individuals you interact with, because barely anyone ever remembers the things you said to them before. There's no real measurement of how your relationship is with other NPCs. Similarly, there's no faction system despite the number of gangs and fixers you're introduced to, all of whom control their own turf. Your impact on the world around you doesn't feel all that tangible. The success of V's actions as a mercenary feels limited because, despite all the money you can make and connections you establish with powerful people who mention your reputation, you're still some criminal living in a dinky studio apartment in a slummy megabuilding for the entire game. Matter of fact, the game rarely gives you any reason to return to that apartment unless you're required to do so for a mission. There's no buffs for sleeping or showering, and unless you're a hoarder who never sells or disassembles loot, there's no reason to stash stuff either, because you can carry a veritable arsenal of weapons and a department store's worth of clothing all at once. You just never feel like you're rising to the top of Night City like V claims to be trying to do several times throughout the story. And then there's mechanics that are only experienced through scripted mission sequences, but never on your own out in the open world, like calling for a Delamain cab to take you places or using brain dances for entertainment. Strangely enough, there's also no way to change your appearance after starting the game. Cyberpunk takes place in a world where people literally have chrome skin, but apparently a barbershop and nail salon are too much to ask for. And all of this stuff is just the tip of the iceberg. The number of concepts the game fails to capitalize on and quality of life mechanics it didn't think to implement is just astounding. And finally, the other thing you're probably waiting for me to touch on: bugs.
Leave her alone, V. She'll get it together. But times like this, she prefers to be alone.
The moment Cyberpunk 2077 launched, a non-stop violent avalanche of bug reports and glitch videos have been spreading around social media like wildfire. And for damn good reason. This game is a broken mess on consoles. I'm fortunate enough to own a PlayStation 5 now, and I think, graphically and frame rate wise, it runs pretty fine. Now remember, this isn't a true next-gen version, just enhanced backward compatibility. With that in mind, I think the visual fidelity is okay. But that didn't really stop me from running headfirst into some bad problems. There was a constant issue throughout the entire game with texture and LOD pop-ins, even in instances where the asset in question was front and center in the middle of the screen. NPCs and inanimate objects sometimes floated in midair for no reason, even during cutscenes. There were also several occurrences of HUD burn-in, where situational text boxes or pop-ups would stay stuck on screen permanently even after they were no longer needed, or the game would claim I was in a hostile area when I actually wasn't, and the only way to fix this sometimes was to reload a save. Similarly, there was a couple of missions where objectives were not checked off even though they were finished. Thankfully, the mission itself was considered complete, so it wasn't a hard progress blocker. On the flip side, there were gigs that had all objectives complete, yet the game wouldn't close the mission, and I ended up failing them after leaving the mission area even though the objective list was empty. Great. I also got the amusing bug of having my male V's dick poking out of his pants, which was quickly fixed by simply unequipping and re-equipping them. And there were moments where dialogue and their respective responses would overlap because an NPC would call me in the middle of meeting another NPC in person.
You can count on me.
I know, V. Coda's contact works at a hospital in Little China.
Same spot
All
as
you have
last
to do
time.
is pick
Don't
up the
make me wait.
implant. The money will take a more secure
What is it?
route.
Gotcha. See you later then.
Overall, there were some annoying bugs that I encountered, but all of them are just peanuts compared to the crashes. In my 40 hours or so of playtime, I encountered exactly 12 crashes to the PS5 home screen. Thankfully, the game autosaves constantly, so I rarely lost more than a couple minutes of progress, but that doesn't excuse the insane frequency of these crashes. The worst part is that they happened in a pattern, so I was eventually able to somewhat predict when one would occur, which was every 2.5 to 3 hours when I was speeding down the street, or on a couple occasions, looking in a mirror. Basically, at some point in every play session, the game was guaranteed to shit itself when loading detailed assets. I would have been willing to accept the existence of literally all of the other bugs and glitches in this game if it just didn't fucking crash so much. As I said, I played this game on PlayStation 5, and I am still damn lucky for it, because if I didn't have the console by now, I probably would have been experiencing this game on a base PS4, which is apparently borderline unplayable, along with the Xbox One S version, thanks to blurry textures and assets, and performance that struggles to hit even 20 frames per second during combat. To say that Cyberpunk isn't optimized for last-gen consoles would be a gross understatement. Just a few days ago, in a call with investors, CDPR outright admitted they paid almost no attention to last-gen versions of the game and put the majority of their focus on PC, and it fucking shows. Leading up to Cyberpunk's release, CDPR had a lot of people on their side, trusting them. But now, who can say? The damage done to their reputation caused by this disaster of a launch looks to be borderline irreparable. Part of me thinks the studio got caught up in their own hype just as much as the players did. And the end result is a broken, buggy mess on top of a game that's really just decent. And honestly, I would say I enjoyed the final product overall, despite the crashes and lack of substantial role-playing elements, but at the same time, it's hard to force myself to play anymore, because the wasted potential weighs too heavily on my mind. Everywhere I turn in this game, I see missed opportunities, most of which CDPR claimed to take advantage of, but clearly never did, so it's not like I'm pulling these expectations out of nowhere. CDPR said life paths would matter. They don't. CDPR said NPCs would feel alive and have detailed daily routines. They don't. CDPR said the police would be dynamic and respond only to calls. They don't. CDPR said quest decisions impact the world. They don't. CDPR said dynamic weather would pose a challenge to survival, such as acid rain. It doesn't. CDPR said the game runs surprisingly well on older consoles. Boy, does it fucking not. And I could go on and on with more examples, but I think I've made my point. There truly is an amazing once-in-a-decade game in here somewhere, but getting to it is going to require 3 or more years of constant bug fixes and content updates. And that's after we dig through all the unkept promises and outright lies spouted by the developers. We were told this would be one of the most immersive and detailed role-playing experiences ever created, but what we actually got was an all-style, little substance, by-the-books action-adventure game that isn't even as good as other action-adventure games that came out this year. CDPR themselves don't even call it an RPG anymore. The official site just says Open World Action Adventure, despite a senior level designer calling the game an RPG first and foremost as recently as August. I can only imagine how much bigger this fallout would be if the game actually launched back in April, long before next-gen consoles were available to soften the blow. Cyberpunk 2077 does do some important things right. The story is fairly gripping, the characters are great, the city itself has an awesome aesthetic, and weapons and vehicles are really cool. The soundtrack has a ton of bangers, and the combat is solid, with a lot of options to explore. But none of those things make up for the disastrous number of bugs, shallow and barely existent role-playing, busted or missing AI, and complete absence of the countless features CDPR outright promised. This game is the type of experience that anyone can say they love simply because the final product is still entertaining to them, and I would understand that. But if someone else said they despise it because of all the unkept promises and wasted potential, I would understand that too. If CDPR simply hadn't dished out so many lies about the game, the backlash would only be about how poor the console performance is. But at the same time, it also likely would have sold less, because how many people were sold exclusively on those lies to begin with? Maybe this game will be worth playing a year from now when most of the kinks are worked out and performance is up to snuff. But even then, it would only be putting a band-aid on a broken bone. If you haven't bought it by now, you might as well just walk away and see where it is in 2023. This concludes my review of Cyberpunk 2077. I'm going to keep the game installed on my PS5 and return to it once in a while as patches come out, so I can see how it progresses as the months pass. And maybe, just maybe, it'll reach a state where it's the game everyone hoped it would be on day one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
What are you gonna do? Cross your legs and meditate till they drop dead?
Wish you dropped dead.